Hi everyone, we're multitasking in the room at the moment. So I'm going to play a video now and I'm just going to introduce David, who's in the video. So David is in his 60s and he's the primary carer for his wife Susie, who was diagnosed with semantic dementia in 2012. So in this video, David's reflecting on his journey with Susie, looking after her and about some of the challenges that COVID has brought, and looking at his future ahead. Susie was placed in care in 2019, so has only recently entered into residential care. He talks about some of the challenges that has brought. Can you tell me a little bit about your story?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Dave is my name, obviously. I've been looking after my wife, Susie. She got diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia semantic variant, or primary progressive aphasia, I think it can be called at times. She got diagnosed in 2012, but she did get tested in 2011, but they weren't sure then. And subsequent to that, I found out that she had a CAT scan on her brain in 2007, which she didn't tell me about. The first symptoms of it were probably now in hindsight, you look back at what was going on then, and you sort of realise that she was having trouble saying words or even typing, particularly, plus also she was, just a bit about Susie's background is that she she founded the chocolate tours in Melbourne in 1993. And I remember once she told me that she got sort of stuck in a place in Melbourne called the Black Arcade. She'd been there umpteen times before and she couldn't remember the name of it. And also she was also a volunteer guide at the National Gallery, and she loved art, but she found it more and more difficult to study the special exhibitions. And I was really surprised in 2010 when she quit, because I knew she loved it. But these were things you saw now in hindsight was happening to her. And through sort of all of this, she became more anxious, and all she wanted was a cure. I probably should go into the fact that, Susie always felt that her body carried her personality. And so therefore, that's why she was such a good talker. But she became more anxious, and in 2015, she attempted a drug overdose twice because she didn't want to end up like she is now. So she got put into hospital then, and sorry, I'll try and compose myself. But out of that came some good, in as much that because they wouldn't let her home until we had got her less anxious, we got onto a transition care package, and through that we came all facilities and home care packages. So that was the only good thing that came out of that. But I think I've said to you before, we all know what's going to happen, but the reality of it happening is confronting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've talked before, David, haven't we, about intellectually knowing it's going to happen, but then the emotional, when it actually does happen, the heart, the head, that disconnection.
I always say I've got a twin brother. I've got the logical twin and I've got the emotional twin.
Absolutely, yeah.
My advice to anyone is, look, it is all about hope, but we all know there's not a lot of hope. We hope one day, and that's why I still like to be in touch with the Frontier group. I hope one day research will come up and stop this progression. But also you've got to have support of people who understand what you go through. And I must say, so that's why sadly you've got to mix with people that know what you're going through. I think the other thing was other really good piece of advice I got particularly when Susie was in when she got sectioned under the Mental Health Act. I just wanted to bring her home, and I said to them at the time, I'm only in my 60s. I'll give up work. I'll bring her home. And they said, no, don't give up anything. Don't give up anything. I think it's really important that the carer keeps a life for themselves. And I've had to give up a couple of things, but there are some things, as you know, my Art Deco Society that I'm still involved in. I still work a couple of days a week. I go to football. I watch the horse racing. I go there. I've kept things interest so that now Susie's not at home. I don't have this massive vacuum. I've got things, not at the moment because I can't go anywhere, but generally speaking, so you've got to have you've got to also make sure you don't give up your life completely, because there is a life afterwards. I mean, I think we've spoken before that one of the aspects is that I do worry about my future. I'm sort of young enough, our lives wasn't going to end up like this. We're in our 60s, we're going to enjoy our retirement. Well, that's not going to happen together. So what's my future going to be? And that's probably one of my anxious moments at the moment, of what I do next.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. We have spoken before about how important it is still to have the essence of yourself. I mean, there's a couple of roles that you are in at the moment. There's just you as David. There's you, David, Susie's husband, and then there's you as Susie's carer. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think we've discussed before, what does the future look like? And I know that can be quite daunting as well, when you spend so much time, loving and caring for someone. Planning, that's quite hard when you don't know what the future holds. Thanks, everyone. I'd just like to thank Dana and Sam as well for their excellent talks about caring. And Dana's going to speak in a little while as well, just about particular supports that are out in the community. So the next thing I'd like to do is introduce Mirelle. So Mirelle's a psychologist and a research assistant with the Frontier Research Group at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. And she works directly with FTD caregivers in performing assessments and in providing education and ongoing psychosocial support throughout the dementia journey. So today, Mirelle's going to talk about grief and loss in frontotemporal dementia. Thanks so much, Mirelle.
So to begin, I wanted to show you some artwork that depicts grief in FTD. And these are two paintings by an American artist named Tori Tinsley, who cares for her mother who has FTD. And the painting on the left shows Tori reaching towards her mother, who looks away without reaching back. And the painting on the right depicts Tori hugging her mother as she slowly slips away. So I chose both these paintings because they really typify the experience of grief in FTD and represent that very deep sense of yearning and longing for someone who is alive, but who is also slipping away. So, in order to understand grief in FTD, we first need to look at how grief presents typically. Grief is a psychological response that we experience when we are faced with a significant loss. And we typically think of grief in the context of physical loss, such as death. Such as death. But grief can occur following a variety of other losses, such as the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, and perhaps one that we can all relate to more recently is the loss of normality during the coronavirus pandemic. So when we're faced with a significant loss, we first experience what is called acute grief. And acute grief is that initial emotional distress that occurs in the early stages of the loss. And that's when the emotions of grief are all encompassing and they really occupy your mind all the time. So that acute grief then eventually transforms into what's called integrated grief, which what that means is over time we adapt to the loss and potentially gain a sense of closure, and we're able to regain a lot of the functioning that might have been lost during those acute stages. Now, the process of grief doesn't unfold as neatly in dementia. So in dementia, grief is a process that begins before physical death. So this is called pre-death grief or dementia grief. And it is an experience that is unique to dementia carers and their families. And whilst post-death grief is also an issue for caregivers. I'll mainly be focusing on pre-death grief in this presentation because of how unique and intertwined it is with dementia caregiving. So let's have a closer look at what characterises dementia grief. So dementia grief is a form of anticipatory grief, which is when you're expecting someone to pass away. And it involves progressive losses that are ambiguous and that also vary in magnitude. So some losses are considered to be bigger than others. And whilst we see this very particular type of grief, anticipatory grief, in the context of other terminal diseases such as cancer, it is very different to dementia grief, because in dementia, the carer and the family has to contend with what is basically the essential parts of the person, such as their cognitive skills, self-awareness, personality, and character. And these losses are particularly devastating because they impair opportunity for connection, communication, the sharing of memories and conversations, all things which are possible to do in any other situation where there's an impending death. And this is even more so the case with FTD, where the early symptoms are a change in personality and character. So there's also a very well-established relationship between depression and grief in dementia caregivers. And although pre-death grief and depression are linked, they're also very different in their presentations. So some examples of the symptoms of pre-death grief include things like yearning, longing, separation, distress, and these types of symptoms can look like depression, but actually they are part of a grief reaction. And it's important that the symptoms of these two things are distinguished, because, especially early on, because they have implications for the kind of support and intervention that is provided to the caregiver and to the family. So if we look at the literature more closely, there's also, numerous studies have also found that pre-death grief increases at particular time points. So it tends to increase when the dementia advances, as the caregiver's own health deteriorates, as caregiver burden increases, and whilst the carer makes plans for nursing home placement, and then at the time of nursing home placement. There is also an association between pre-death grief and post-death complicated grief. So complicated grief is that kind of prolonged, unresolved grief after death. And a couple of studies have shown that greater pre-death grief during life is a key predictor of post-death complicated grief in dementia caregivers. And approximately 20% of dementia caregivers will experience this prolonged complicated grief following death. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that in dementia, grief is not just a standalone symptom, it's an overarching process that can begin at any time point during the disease process, anywhere from diagnosis to the very late stages of dementia. And in FTD, this grief process may come about earlier than in other dementias, simply because of the nature of the early losses and the course that the disease takes. So the literature also shows us that there are potentially different grief reactions in adult children caregivers and spousal caregivers, which also vary at the different dementia stages. And as you can see in this table here, it seems to be that the biggest differences in grief reactions between adult children and spousal caregivers occurs in the mild to moderate stages of dementia. So you can see that there's an array of emotions that are felt, but perhaps there's slightly more acceptance with the spousal caregivers and more focus on maintaining the relationship in the spousal caregivers. Another important finding from the grief literature is the factors that are associated with grief severity. And from this slide, you can see that it seems to be that certain helpful and certain unhelpful coping strategies, along with other situational factors, impact the severity of grief. So things like adaptation of the caregiver to the current situation, acceptance of the losses, pre-morbid marriage dissatisfaction, they're all things that are associated with lower grief severity. And then you see things like avoidant coping mechanisms, self-blame, and expectation to institutionalize are all associated with greater severity of grief. So we've looked at a few of the characteristics of dementia grief, but now I want to actually show you a theoretical model of grief. And unfortunately, there's no specific theoretical models of grief in FTD that has been described in the literature, but I'm going to show you a model which characterises dementia grief as this evolving process that impacts caregiver burden and distress. And this model is called the dementia grief model. And in the dementia grief model, grief is said to cycle between three states: separation, liminality, and re-emergence. And within these three states, there are mechanisms, which is in the blue writing. These mechanisms function to facilitate grief and to basically move the person through the grief process. And conversely, there are barriers in each state. So those are the ones in red, and they prevent movement through the grief process. And before we go any further, I just wanted to say as well that this grief process is considered to be normal and healthy within the context of dementia caregiving. So this is a process that is meant to happen. So let's have a look at the first state. The first state is one of separation. And separation from the person with dementia begins before physical death, as we know, through a series of what's called compounded serial losses. So what that means is that over the disease course, over time, the number of symptoms, like the ones I've listed there, and therefore losses, increases and intensifies. So in FTD, some of the early losses include the meaning of words, speech, motivation, empathy, inhibitory control. And these losses are unique to FTD, and they aren't typically seen in the early stages of other dementias like Alzheimer's disease. So these early losses then progress to more advanced losses, which is where the person's functional ability starts to decline. And carers also describe a series of more intangible losses. So the loss of future plans, in spouses, the loss of a romantic partner, the loss of marital life, and even things like the loss of personal freedom and the loss of control. And each of these losses progressively leads to a separation from the person with FTD. So the more losses, the more sense of separation that is felt. Now, the mechanism which is in this state is acknowledgement of each loss. And without the first step of acknowledgement, there is no graduation towards adapting to the circumstance that the carer is in, or even to the reality of the loss. And I say this quite easily, but I also understand that acknowledging these losses can be really, really challenging because the losses are unpredictable, they're largely irresolvable, and they can occur at a really fast rate as well. So, for example, a person with FTD can lose the ability to cook, drive, and be left alone all within the span of a few months. So the next state is called liminality. And liminality refers to being in between a previous situation and a new emerging situation. And in dementia, in this grief process, it is considered necessary to transition between the old situation and into the new situation. And I just want to point out that there is a very difficult but crucial transition that occurs early on from the pre-diagnostic stage, where the carer is in this state of sort of searching for reasons for the behavioural changes that are happening, to then transitioning to this kind of new situation where they sort of have to live with the reality that all these changes are occurring due to this condition called FTD, for which there is no cure and for which they don't know how much time they have left as well. Another very difficult aspect of the liminal state is coming to terms with how ambiguous some of the losses are. And this ambiguity is considered to be, by many, to be the defining characteristic of grief in FTD. So when someone is diagnosed with FTD, there is no post-diagnostic roadmap that they can follow. There's no formally defined or widely accepted stages of FTD, despite all the research. There's no timeline either. And carers have to contend with the fact that FTD is ultimately terminal, but its course can run anywhere from 2 to 20 years. So there's lots of unknowns and there's lots of grey areas. And I think one of the most ambiguous and profound changes that happens in FTD is the loss of self. And what I mean by that is the deterioration of personality and identity, such that the person slowly becomes psychologically inaccessible. And this is particularly the case with behavioural variant FTD, where the person will eventually express themselves as though they are someone else or someone new, or at least not who they used to be. And this is really hard to comprehend, especially for carers and for family members, because the person that they look after doesn't act like the person that they once knew, but they are the same person. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the person with dementia is physically present, but they're also psychologically absent. And the mechanism in this state is opening up to and tolerating difficult feelings, whether it's sadness, anger, frustration, guilt, resentment, or even hope. Those emotions are neither good nor bad, they're just there to be felt. So now we move on to the last stage, which is called re-emergence. And think of this state as being one of acceptance. So acceptance of the losses that we had gone over before, acceptance of your own emotions, and acceptance of a new and different future. So The mechanism in this state that helps move the person through grief is what's called behavioural adaptation, which is more practical in nature. So some examples of behavioural adaptation include arranging care, putting in place power of attorney, taking over responsibilities previously held by the person with dementia. And for people who have language problems, learning things like new ways of communicating with the person with dementia. So I think this state is important because FTD is a disease where, and in fact all dementias are diseases where there is no clear resolution, and I think maybe adaptation is the closest that we can get to a resolution. And it is considered to be a sort of precursor to achieving any sense of closure and stability. And although there are many aspects of the person and indeed life that are grieved, carers often report this sense of newfound meaning through caregiving, and even this sense of post-traumatic growth. So to summarise, grief is a unique process, and it begins prior to physical death, as we know. So it can begin anywhere from diagnosis to even the late stages of dementia. We know that grief has characteristics of, dementia grief has characteristics of many other types of grief, particularly anticipatory grief, but it can also have characteristics of traumatic grief and even disenfranchised grief. We know from the literature that dementia grief is associated with depression. It is expressed differently in adult children caregivers versus spousal caregivers, and the severity of the grief can be influenced by situational factors and also through by the way that carers cope with the grief. Sorry, the slides aren't working again. Okay, and just a few more points in the summary. So we know that pre-death grief is a predictor of post-death complicated grief, which means that perhaps there are some factors in that pre-death grief stage that we can modify to prevent post-death complicated grief. We know that dementia grief begins earlier and comes about in a more ambiguous way. Most importantly, grief in the context of dementia caregiving is a very normal and healthy response, and movement through the grief process that I had described may alleviate caregiver burden and stress. And finally, I would like to impart some practical tips for addressing dementia grief that are not only natural conclusions from the literature, but also from the lived experiences of FTD caregivers. So knowing that dementia grief happens earlier in the disease process, it may be a good idea to seek grief counselling early on. We know that pre-death grief can prevent post-death complicated grief. Know that the feelings of grief aren't always easy to recognise, and they can be confused with depression. And so it's really important to try and differentiate between all the different things that you're feeling, whether it's grief, stress, anger, resentment, etc. Try and connect with the person with FTD in different kind of ways. There's many ways besides communication in which we can connect with each other. Remember that FTD is full of grey areas, and perhaps it's a matter of embracing that ambiguity and learning to let go of the need for certainty and absolute answers. The next point refers to striking a balance between managing everything you need to do in terms of taking care of the person with dementia, but also looking after yourself. It's important to grieve in an open and adaptive manner before the person's death, and whether that's with the help of a professional like a psychologist or counsellor, or with a trusted friend or family member. Some of the literature shows that having that support from the same person before and after death is helpful because there's that consistency. And lastly, try and foster as much adaptation and proactivity as possible. And finally, I'd like to thank the entire Fronty team and all the inspiring participants and their carers, because our work would not be possible without them. Thank you.